We have calculators that show, and most of them are pretty mind blown about if I only violate a quarter of 1% of my outbound calling, which seems like very few, there's still tens of millions of dollars of lawsuit potential. So putting it on paper to show what your risk is, I think could be a really compelling argument for any internal part of the organization.
Today, I'm honored to be talking to Clay McNaught, who is COO of Gryphon.AI, along with Michelle Tilton, who's VP of Marketing at Gryphon.AI, about a topic that we all believe isn't getting the spotlight it really needs. And this is not a promotional topic. It's scary, you better pay attention to it kind of a topic. So with that as a setup, thanks, Clay, and thanks, Michelle, for joining me. Really appreciate this. And since I've done such a high-level job of introducing you, maybe you could just talk to us a little bit about what you do at Gryphon, your roles there, and maybe even just for the audience's sake, what Gryphon does, what you're all about.
Go ahead,
Clay,
Clay.
you want to take that?
Okay. Good morning, Mike. My name's Clay McNaught. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Gryphon.AI, and I've been with the company for about a year. And really what we focus on is end-to-end compliant conversations, communications. And so on the front end, everybody's aware of the do not call list, TCPA. We have many TCPAs. We have a new ruling from the FCC. And so at the beginning of a conversation, it's ensuring that you're contacting the right people at the right time, and then taking it one step further into the conversation, ensuring that you're having a compliant conversation, especially with the new rules that came out, ensuring that, if an individual wants to be contacted about a specific service, that conversation pertains to that service. And then through that conversation, especially with some of the caveats to how this is going to impact sellers, really putting your best foot forward and presenting from an enablement standpoint, that individual providing the right information at the right time to be able to either secure a sale or have a quality conversation. And then at the end of the conversation, having the ability to understand and measure the overall success and quality of that conversation is really, at a high level. There's a lot more to it, but we've been doing this definitely on the compliance side for over 20 years. And really, our passion is the fact of, that we can provide real-time compliance or certification. And so, if you look at the current landscape, organizations either have IT firms that are building it manually, which we've seen, and, you look at, the impact that, if somebody has an opt-out from text messaging, that has to be honored within a 24-hour period. Some large enterprises package together these big marketing campaigns, and it can take about 3-4 months for them to get all of the data, all of the contact information. And then once that campaign is released, you have no idea what changes have been made or areas in which you're not compliant. And then you send out a blast marketing campaign that could have tremendous exposure as it relates to FCC and class action.
Yeah, huge. And I'm looking forward to kind of unrolling the whole FCC ruling as it stands. But first, maybe Michelle, tell us a little bit about your role at Gryphon and what you do there.
Sure. So I'm the VP of Marketing, so kind of a broad term that encompasses all of our go-to-market strategies and thought leadership relations. And this is a big part of our thought leadership. So we pride ourselves in the space of being on top of all of the rulings and regulations that continuously change the landscape, so our customers know what's going on and can understand what's coming down the pipe. So a big part of our strategy really is to educate both customers and prospects so that things like Clay just mentioned don't happen to them, and they continuously have compliant conversations, inbound and outbound.
If I can, I want to try and set this conversation up by going back a few years to when GDPR was first announced and CCPA and all of its variants that kind of popped up later there. And what I'm just going to say was the state of the realization that the landscape was changing back then. And it's been an interesting thing to kind of watch evolve. as people start to recognize, uh-oh, this thing has teeth in it, I better comply. What's involved in compliance, what tools you need, and what kinds of oversight you need to manage that has become an industry unto itself. And I kind of feel like this new FCC rule, which is just kind of a node on an existing set of rules, they're all pointed in that same direction, really has the ability to maybe even inadvertently change the lead conversation landscape in just as much of a wholesale way. I don't know how you feel about that, but to me, it looks like, hey, wait a second. We just are about to become all at risk here because of the way we're going about doing business. Your thoughts on that? And I'll drop this in front of you first, Clay, and I'd love to hear your thoughts after that, Michelle.
Yeah, you're spot on, Mike. And really it's, we think of things as a free market, meaning we can contact anybody at any time about anything. And the reality is that the FCC is really trying to force more of an opt-in specificity for email to text messaging. For example, like comparison shoppers websites and lead generators now have to obtain consumer consent to receive automated communications rather than simultaneously having a single consent apply to multiple telemarketers. So if you're looking for a home loan, saying, oh, I'm looking for a home loan, all of a sudden that blasts out to a number of mortgage companies. Now it will have to be more focused on specific organizations selling a specific service that aligns with the consent by that consumer. So taking it one step further, this consent and one-on-one consent is really going to end the practice of robocalling and robotext from unrelated and unexpected sellers and solicitors. It's really going to, and even in Europe, Europe has with GDPR an opt-in where an individual has to opt in for a seller to be able to reach out to them. And I think that's the direction we're going. And so it's really going to force sellers and leads can still be generated. It's all about, using automated systems. And so you're still going to have that practice, but, there's been just under 2,000 TCPA lawsuits this year. And looking at these I don't think that the goal is to really hurt the SMBs, the small and medium businesses, but from an enterprise perspective, you really have to focus on what you're doing and how you're doing it, because just in October and November, we're seeing that of the suits that were filed, up to 70% of those are class action. And we provide litigator lists, and there's hundreds and hundreds of attorneys. There's serial plaintiffs that are aligned with tens, if not hundreds of different suits. And so there are organizations that are looking for, these groups or these enterprises to miss a step, and then they end up soliciting and reaching out to say if you've been contacted. And when you talk about the overall magnitude of this, even though the fines from how they're advertised range from $500 to $1,500 per violation, the TCPA has also taken a cap, or there's no cap on the overall liability. So we I think this year at the beginning of the year, we saw almost $1 billion fine for a MLM company that had 1.8 million solicitations.
Goodness gracious. That's just, I want to let that number hang in the air here for a minute, because that's just huge. I mean, that's meaningful in a massive way. Michelle, I wanted to just, since you're in a marketing role, you have to pay attention to kind of the pulse of the market, of your market, I'm sure in some way. What's your feeling on the awareness of this kind of regulation right now? I'd say just start with awareness. And then in the broader industry that we all serve, how are they dealing with it? Or are they? Is this just kind of like there's something else on the horizon I can't get to right now?
So this one's kind of interesting because I do feel like what you said earlier holds a lot of merit. That I feel when we went through CCPA several years ago, the very first round of CCPA, I worked in a data and analytics company. So we were heavily impacted there. And I think a lot of the folks who aren't truly lead generators, maybe lead buyers, have heard this news about the FCC's ruling and are kind of like, well, let's just see what happens. Or maybe, maybe we'll have to change a few things. Similar to the CCPA, once you get into it and you really sit down and say, okay, we have to address this right now, you're going to realize how far behind you are if you haven't started. Because that's kind of the whole, it's so similar in terms of how these rulings sort of quietly came down the pipe. And now all of a sudden, people like us who are in it are very, very aware of what the impact will be in 6 months. But I don't know that all the companies who leverage that marketing channel are fully aware of the implications. And similar to CCPA, it also it requires you to unwind every piece of process that you currently have internally and truly understand every single piece of that process to ensure that you're doing it correctly going forward. So I think there's a big push of people who know this has happened and they say, wow, this is going to be big, but I don't think they've unpacked how it's going to truly impact their org until they sit down and say, okay, now's the time we have to address this. And it will be huge. It'll be huge, from losing an entire channel potentially. As a marketer, that doesn't just, you can't just make that up in 6 months. You
Right.
have to plan now in order to recapture that audience and really truly get back to that missing channel.
Or if you're, other side of that, if you're an enterprise level lead generator,
Mhm.
you may be out of business if you're not careful.
Or you're going to
Just
have
by-
to get really creative on ensuring your partnerships with the largest enterprises so that you can get that one-to-one seller consent
Yeah.
through, more mass programs, but that limits their whole audience now from, SMB is almost completely taken out of the picture.
Yeah. I was looking at the language of the ruling, at least the summary language. I didn't get too deep into the weeds there, but the ruling seems like it was crafted to target, just as you said, Clay, the robocallers and spammers. Mostly that's the target. But this seems to me like the way it's crafted, the implications go far beyond that user set. As we've been talking about here, if you buy leads on a third party basis from anybody, you're now impacted somehow. And the risks, I think, probably have yet to be quantified, but they're probably going to be significant. I guess my early take on this ruling is it's pretty scary, but it also seems like, if you permit me, a kind of a dumb bomb approach. Like, we want to take care of the robocallers and eradicate those people as best we can. But in so doing, there's a lot of collateral damage that other legitimate, well-meaning, well-designed, well-run enterprises are probably going to catch because of what these robocallers have done. So even though I didn't see language that anywhere expressly pointed towards legitimate enterprise use of these leads, it seems like by implication, you're still getting the finger pointed at you. Thoughts?
Guilty before proven innocent.
Yeah, there you go. Right. Yeah.
And I think you're right, that it's very broad, but I also think that from what we're seeing and the fines that we're seeing, that the FCC doesn't believe that everybody is taking this seriously. And part of this ruling too is that wireless companies have to block kind of the red flagged robotexting numbers, which is one step because a lot of those are overseas, and so it's preventing that. But what we're seeing, and even right now, when you say it's a crackdown, we have organizations, because DNC and TCPA doesn't just have an umbrella over the US where there's just single rules that sellers have to abide by. We have now many TCPAs, and we have states. You mentioned CCPA. We have states that are coming out and creating their own rules around this type of not only solicitations, but also when you can call, how many times you can call, if you can record, the fact that if you're doing outreach, you have to divulge a certain amount of information up front. And I use the guilty before proven innocent. If you can't defend yourself, meaning if you don't have a recording or a transcription of that conversation where you can defend your position, then it's almost impossible for you to be able to protect yourselves. And we have customers and we're seeing people that are coming out and they're choosing not to market in certain states because they don't have these checks and balances in place.
Yeah, a big chunk of your outreach just vaporized effectively. So let's talk practicalities for a minute. You're an enterprise user of these leads or something like them. You see that you're potentially at risk here. What is a CMO to do about that? I mean, how do you kind of, once your light bulb starts going off, and I think that's probably step one, is to like, please light bulb go off. Um, what do you do? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, so I think there's the navigation of your provider, and then there's the navigation of internal. How do we navigate this for generating our own leads? And I think the first thing is to understand where all of these leads are coming from and every single provider you're getting the leads from, which you should know, which anybody should know. But step one, document all of that. And step two is understanding if you can still receive generated leads from them, provided that your company is one of, let's say, a checkbox on a form fill that specifically enables you to call that lead, from a consent to that company name about that key topic, by the way, because that's another piece of that ruling. So, if I'm a bank, I have to make sure I'm calling about mortgages and not trying to switch to another topic like auto loans or something. But anyway, so the first thing I'm going to do is really take an inventory of those lead generators and see where do I have the potential for fall off in terms of lead volume, and then how do I make up that volume through other lead channels or traffic. And I think there's a lot of things I thought about last week when we saw this pass, where marketers are going to have to really focus on quality of what they offer, differentiation. So when I'm one of 10 mortgage providers on a form fill, that the consumer I'm top of mind enough for the consumer for them to select my company. Because now that you have that push-pull marketing part of that now, right? It's almost like you're going to have to market for the leads that might even be on the lead generator's website to be top of mind.
Right.
So there's that. There's increasing traffic to your own site, right? Increasing lead volume. You can buy traffic. You can buy traffic through programmatic and Google AdWords and those different types of channels. But now your offer better be really compelling for that consumer to provide their information. So I'd be doing a whole lot of estimation of lead volumes and how we can make those up in other channels. And then I would think more holistically about the value we bring to those prospects to make sure that we are the ones selected, which seems like an easy thing. We should offer consumers what they want to hear and what they want and truly give them what they're looking for. But that requires an entire orchestration of creative and content and positioning. And so there's a lot to unpack there. And hence why the 6-month window is not very long at all.
No, and not to put words in your mouth at all, but it seems like uh, again, once the light bulb goes off and you've decided how you want to approach this, there are an entirely new set of tools that you're probably going to want to deploy to ensure that you are compliant, to understand on a message basis what the real genuine quality of your messaging and the channels and the creative and everything goes into it really is. And isn't that really, the brass ring that all of marketing kind of tends towards? But it seems to me like this ruling and so many others that are kind of pointing in that same direction are forcing the issue. It's forcing marketers to go back to a quality mindset where we've been so much about quantity in the past. And maybe that's a a sliding scale one to the other, but it seems to me like it shouldn't be quite so binary, like it's either one or the other. You really need quantity and you need quality. And I talk to marketers all day long, and everybody's intent on quality, but not necessarily focused on quality. So maybe this just kind of repoints the conversation. I don't know.
No, you're spot on. I think internally when we had our first conversation, Clay, and that question sort of popped up, I think the first thing I said is marketers are going to have to provide quality. They're going to actually have to focus on quality. And quality at scale, it's always the conversation, right? I think every marketing group has that conversation all the time. We need leads, but they need to be quality. How do we find that balance? And I think that's always going to be a tough choice. But when you start seeing that quality converts at a higher percentage than quantity, you start seeing that impact, you can make that argument a little easier. But I don't think you put words in my mouth at all. I think that's exactly what I
Okay.
said the first time we talked about that internally.
It's
So
precision versus casting a wide net and trying to see what you can catch.
funny thing about marketers, though, being one myself, is that we have a really well developed sense of the nuance of language. I'm being kind to myself and my peers here. We will always say, and I think we will always believe that we're working out quality as we go. But our KPIs, our bonuses, all of our incentive structures are largely based on quantity metrics. So there's a lot that has to change there behind the scenes as well.
Yeah, I think, and we have those conversations in our group internally too. We look at a lot more metrics, and that's probably a different conversation than this one, but we look at a lot more metrics that take us all the way through the funnel, not just MQLs and flip them over and here are the leads. We tend to look at it much more holistically all the way through the funnel, through pipeline, through close won, close lost, and why, and which channels are producing the quality in those buckets of won, lost. So I do think that I think we tend to do a pretty good job internally of being honest with ourselves there and trying to develop sort of that balance. But I do know from being at other organizations that there's always pressure for more, and that can drive to less quality leads coming in the door.
Yeah. I'm curious, Clay, from an operational standpoint, you're COO at Gryphon, um, and this doesn't necessarily apply universally, but as someone who runs operations in a decent sized organization, these kinds of considerations here from the FCC's ruling are going to apply to COOs in all kinds of industries that are affected here. So there's a series of operational complexities that have to be dealt with as well. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how others in your position might end up navigating that.
It's really understanding your operation. And one of the changes that we've seen post-COVID is the fact that a lot of organizations and large organizations are working in a distributive environment, which means you don't have the controls of a single platform that everybody's dialing out on. You've got people on their personal cell phones. And if you're on your personal cell phone, you can't control who you're calling, no idea whether they're on a do not call list, you're violating TCPA. And what's happening is that with these class action suits, they're identifying and finding all of these groups, bringing them together to provide a suit against an organization. And so I would say first and foremost, it would be a situation of, are we at risk? What are the areas of risk? Can we alleviate the risk? And if we alleviate the risk, how are we ensured that the risk is alleviated? Because a lot of times, as I described earlier, talking about, building these marketing campaigns, you really don't understand the liability until it's too late. And
Right.
so getting in front of it and ensuring that you are, compliant with all of these guidelines is paramount. And so what that means, sometimes it's overwhelming. IT departments say, well, we can build it in-house. And so now you're building applications, you're running those. And again, you don't have the peace of mind to fully believe that you're compliant across the board with your organization. And so it's a big deal. And, our fear, and we've seen this, is, people don't address it until it's too late.
Right. I mean, just to go back to the earlier part of our conversation with GDPR and CCPA and the like, it seemed to me like that those topics, the data privacy and security issues, only became important once you started seeing dollar figures associated with them. When you started seeing some of the first fines, that's when I think you can look at kind of the media hype curve, and somebody gets a $70 million fine, and there have been a handful of those. Well, that's newsworthy. And if you're an enterprise operating in any kind of a adjacent space, you got to pay attention to that. And I wonder if with this kind of a ruling, it doesn't make sense to, is there an ROI to a a risk mitigation investment. I don't think you look at it in terms of ROI, but maybe you look at it in terms of, here's what we're potentially saving ourselves from.
We look at that very strongly with people that we're speaking to that want to become customers, our prospects. And we have calculators that show, and most of them are pretty mind blown about if I only violate a quarter of 1% of my outbound calling, which seems like very few, there's still tens of millions of dollars of lawsuit potential. So putting it on paper to show what your risk is, I think could be a really compelling argument for any internal part of the organization. Because I certainly wouldn't want to be the marketer at this company who gets that phone call, right? And I don't think anybody would. But the interesting part here is like CCPA, this is not just a marketing issue. It's a marketing, operations, IT, sales. It spans departmentally everybody who touches any part of the go-to-market motion at a company. So you can't really just wait and sit back and say, oh, marketing will handle that. Similar to CCPA, we had an internal group, I want to say of probably 15 to 18 people to execute the entire initiative over an 18-month window to make sure that that was being adhered to. This is like day one of people should be worried about this right now.
Right. I mean, I would say that in addition to the different divisions in the business, it almost has to become a cultural shift. This is just the way we're going to think about our customers and prospects. And that's a hard one.
And when you try to, you brought up the fact, how do you know where you stand from an executive standpoint? Our research shows that organizations that don't have any policies or programs in place, generally 24% of their outbound communications violate DNC TCPA.
Wow.
Even those that have implemented manual processes around those, you can have up to 10, 12% because of the dynamics and the changing landscape.
Yeah. Extend that out and it becomes a real number, a real liability.
Yeah. And we're also seeing, and I think you hit on this a little bit, earlier it was, hey, we just want to draw attention to it. Here are the maximum fines and the FCC, and the rulings were quite small. And now we're seeing those escalate into larger and larger situations. And with that being said, also you look at, the organizations who are being fined and who are having these violations. It's every vertical that you can imagine.